Okay, with this video, we're going to take a look at the last 3 types of nutrients and just kind of go over these. So we're going to do 3 in this one little video. So water is the first nutrient we're going to talk about. Now, water is inorganic, meaning it doesn't contain carbon. So I've given you the formula here, H2O, to show you that there's no carbon in that. So it's inorganic. It does not produce energy. So this is not one of your energy yielding nutrients. Remember, not all nutrients produce energy. This one is not. It provides an environment, though, for all of the body's activities. So it's kind of the solvent that is there for all of the various solutes that the body has. So now let's take a look at vitamins. And I'm giving you the structure of just a generic vitamin, vitamin C, to just show you all that based on looking at this, you can see it contains carbon. So you should be able to say, oh, that's an organic molecule. So it is a micronutrient, meaning you need these in small quantities. I didn't put that on there for water. I guess you would say it's a macronutrient, okay? With the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the fats. You could put water as a macronutrient, but vitamins are a micronutrient. You need them in small amounts. They are organic. They are carbon-containing molecules. However, they're not energy yielding, so they do not go directly to producing ATP. They're kind of a helper molecule. So just like we talked about with amino acids, this is the same as far as the definitions go. Vitamins, you can have 2 classes of them. You can classify vitamins a ton of different ways. We're going to say some are essential, some are non-essential. Essential means they cannot be made by the body, where non-essential vitamins are. So if they cannot be made by the body, how do you get them? Well, you're going to have to get essential nutrients from what you eat. And if you look at foods, it'll say made with so many essential vitamins and minerals. The reason why is because your body can't make those. That's why they're called essential. So be aware when you're looking at food labels and things, when it starts using that word essential, that's what it's talking about. Vitamins, you can also classify them based on fat or water soluble. You do need to know the difference between your fat soluble vitamins versus your water soluble vitamins. And how I remember the fat soluble vitamins, I know they're out of order, but they spell a word for me, CADE. That's, people sometimes are named that, so it just makes sense. That's how I remember vitamin K, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E. Those are fat soluble. Whereas water soluble vitamins are vitamins C and the whole B class of vitamins. There's a whole bunch of different kind of B vitamins. What's the difference between them? Well, you can actually overdose on your fat soluble vitamins. It is very hard to overdose on water soluble vitamins. So vitamins are not broken down, so your body uses them as is. So because they are organic, they can be destroyed. If the chemical structure of a vitamin is destroyed, its function is lost. So how are some ways that you can destroy that structure of that vitamin? So just because your food, before you eat it, has it in it, doesn't mean that by the time you get done cooking it, that vitamin is still intact. So that's why it's better to eat fresh fruits and vegetables, because the vitamins are intact. You microwave them, cook the heck out of them, and all that kind of stuff. You're destroying the vitamin. And the vitamins, while they may have been there initially, they won't be there by the time you get done cooking it, for example. So keep that in mind. That's, again, why a lot of times fresh fruits and vegetables are better for you. Let's take a look at minerals next, our last class of nutrients. So minerals, you need them in small quantities. They're micronutrients. They are inorganic. They do not contain carbon. Remember what we said minerals were? Minerals are elements off the periodic table. So chemists call them elements. Biologists call them minerals. It's the same thing. So sodium, well, it doesn't have any carbon. Fluorine, it doesn't have any carbon. So these are not carbon. So it's inorganic. Non-energy yielding. Now we can label them or classify them in terms of major minerals versus trace minerals. Major minerals is any mineral that you need 100 milligrams of more per day or more per day, where a trace mineral is one that you need less than 100 milligrams per day. I'm not going to ask you which ones are macro and which ones are micro or trace. Your major versus your trace. I'm not going to give you, oh, cobalt, is it a macro or a micro? I'm not going to ask you that. I'm just giving you those as examples. You can even see your vitamins over here. Okay, they're also over there telling you how much you need a day, in case you were wondering. This is the summary slide for your 6 different nutrients. So this is the big takeaway. Good way to summarize everything real quick and easy here. So you've got your energy yielding nutrients, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, meaning they're going to make ATP, whether they're organic or inorganic, and whether they're a macronutrient or a micronutrient. And again, I'm not really worried about water on that part. I guess it'd technically be a macronutrient. Now we're going to take a look at cellular respiration and energy sources. So cellular respiration, if you all remember back from your biology review, the purpose of cellular respiration is to convert energy yielding nutrients, the one we always talked about was glucose, into energy. That's the whole point. And this takes place in the mitochondria of your cells. So you've got glucose plus 6 oxygens produce, those arrows mean produce, 6 carbon dioxide molecules as a waste product, 6 water molecules as a waste product. We know that's actually part of where you get your water from. And about 38 ATPs. Now again, that 38 depends on a lot of different factors, but anywhere between 34 and 38 is a fair number there. ATP molecules, and this is one glucose molecule is going to end up making that much ATP. What are your steps of cellular respiration? You need to know your steps. The first step is glycolysis. I am not going to ask you what's step 1. I'm going to ask you what comes next. So if glycolysis comes first, what comes next? So I'm not going to say what's step 4. Okay, you just need to know these in order. So glycolysis, which literally means to split sugar. That's what's going on there. And then a lot of people don't really put this as a separate step. I do. Because it is. I mean, you have to get pyruvate to acetyl-CoA or nothing's going to happen. So that's another little breakdown. You could have included that in the glycolysis if you wanted to. But the end product of glycolysis is pyruvate, and you've got to make that to acetyl-CoA, which is your entry molecule into the Krebs cycle. So step 3 is the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, also known as the TCA cycle. TCA stands for tricarboxylic acid, is what that means. All the same thing. Okay, this is talking about those molecules as they circle through the cycle, so that's where those come from. Step 4 is the electron transport chain. This is literally transporting electrons. And then step 5 is chemiosmosis, which is the formation of ATP. So let's take a look at this. You have this in your packet, so go ahead and pull this out and make sure you can follow along here. Just to show you where we're at, this structure here is the mitochondria. So you can see this in yellow. You can see all of that. Remember, this is a double phospholipid bilayer, so it's very special. It has 2 phospholipid bilayers, just like the nucleus does. So there's your mitochondria there. And cellular respiration takes place within the mitochondria. So this is the cytosol of the cell. So you remember the mitochondria is inside of a cell. So the glucose has entered the cell and is hanging out in the cytosol. And that is where glycolysis takes place. It takes place in the cytoplasm or cytosol of the cell. And you're going to have 1 glucose molecule, and through the process of glycolysis, you're going to end up with 2 pyruvates. Now, your pyruvate is going to get converted to acetyl-CoA. Remember, that was step 2 that we said. I'll just put a 2 here because that was step 2. This right here was step 1, if you want to number the steps. The process of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA is how that molecule enters the mitochondria. So now you've got it inside the mitochondria. Step 3 was the Krebs cycle, citric acid cycle, tricarboxylic acid cycle. Notice it's circular because it is a cycle. So that acetyl-CoA is going to enter the cycle, and then you're going to have electron transport chain. So that also happens within the mitochondria. You've got the electron transport chain, which is step number 4. If you wanted to remember the step numbers, I'm not going to ask you step numbers. And then 5 is that chemiosmosis step. So the only thing that doesn't happen inside the mitochondria is glycolysis. Now, what is this other stuff going on? We have this NADH. This NADH and this FADH2, regardless of where it's made, you're going to get some NADH from the breakdown of glucose to pyruvate, glycolysis. You're going to get some NADH formed. You're going to get some NADH formed as you go from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. You're going to get some more NADH formed. The breakdown of the citric acid cycle, as that cycles through, you're going to get some NADA and you're going to get some NADH and some FADH2. Now, these are your high energy molecules. NADH, regardless of where it's made, NADH2, FADH2, these are high energy molecules that are going to enter into that electron transport chain. Okay, so that's what those are doing. That's what those are. Look, electron shuttles right there. NADH, FADH2, those are electron shuttles. Now, through the process of this, let me also bring your attention to this other piece. From the breakdown of glucose to pyruvate, you're going to get some ATP formed. You're not going to get any ATP from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, but you're going to get some ATP being produced as a byproduct of the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. So you're going to get like 4 ATP so far, again, from one glucose molecule. But look what happens with the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. This is where you're going to end up with about 32 to 34. So the majority of the ATP gets made at the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis stage to give you somewhere between 36, 38 ATPs for one glucose, per one glucose molecule. And again, it depends on those high energy molecules, that NADH and that FADH2, and where they enter in exactly as to how much ATP ends up coming out. Okay, so that's kind of why there's always not an exact amount there. I do have some videos for you to watch to go over electron transport chain and some other things. So let's talk about chemiosmosis for just a second. Chemiosmosis, this right here is just the coolest thing ever to me. Take a look at that motor. This is within the mitochondria. This is moving. This is a protein that is moving inside your mitochondria, and with every turn, it is cranking out ATPs. So it is just the coolest space ever, coolest thing ever. Sorry, I was reading that word right there. This is the intermembrane space. You are within the membrane of the mitochondria. This is the mitochondrial matrix, the very, very inside. So what happens is with chemiosmosis, you have a hydrogen ion gradient. Take a look right here. You have a high concentration of hydrogen ions in the intermembrane space of the mitochondria, and you have a low number of hydrogen ions on the mitochondrial matrix side. So this creates, as you can see, a situation where you've got a gradient. You've got a high concentration on one side, low concentration on the other. So diffusion is naturally going to happen and bring things from an area of high to low concentration. So as those hydrogen ions move through this protein, this rotor right here, that is so cool. As it's moving through that rotor, those hydrogen ions are coming through, and it's turning, as you can see over here, it is turning that rotor right there, and it is making ATP. So with each time one goes through, you're going to have 3 hydrogen ions come through, and then that's going to turn, and on the inside of that mitochondrial matrix, an ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is going to be forced to bind with a phosphorus, and that's going to make ATP. So is that just not cool? This is also known as a proton motive force. It uses protons, also known as hydrogen ions, to perform the work. And this whole structure right here, that whole rotor, is called the ATP synthase molecule. It's an enzyme that makes ATP using energy from the proton or the hydrogen ion as it's moving through to get from one side to the other side, from high concentration to low concentration. Just cool stuff. That is chemiosmosis. So now let's take a look at this handout that you have. This is what I call your hamburger handout. Y'all are familiar with probably eating a hamburger. So when you eat the hamburger, what's happening? Well, your body's going to digest it, and within the hamburger, you have got your 3 macromolecules, your 3 nutrients, your proteins, your carbohydrates, and fats. Now, where do these 3, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, what do they get broken down into? Proteins get broken down into their building blocks, amino acids. Carbohydrates get broken down into their building blocks, glucose, and fats get broken down into their building blocks, glycerol and 3 fatty acid chains, monoglycerides. So where do these building blocks, I'm just going to put building blocks right there, where do these building blocks, how do they make ATP? So what you're seeing here is glucose to pyruvate, that is glycolysis. You're seeing pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. You're seeing pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Then you're seeing the acetyl-CoA molecule enter into the tricarboxylic acid cycle, citric acid cycle, Krebs cycle, okay? And then that's going to go to the electron transport chain. And then number 4 is that chemiosmosis step where ATP gets made. So here you get that bundle of electrons, and there you get the ATP. And then water is also a byproduct of the electron transport chain. Okay, so you have to know that as well. So take a look at your carbohydrates. This is the one we're used to looking at. This is your cellular respiration. You've got your carbohydrates broken down into glucose. That glucose, through the process of glycolysis, turns into pyruvate. That's familiar. We know where glucose comes in. But if we've got proteins, proteins are an energy-yielding nutrient. So they also have the ability to make ATP. Well, if this is how we get ATP, where do the amino acids come into this cellular respiration equation, so to speak? Well, amino acids can come in and get converted to pyruvate, which will then enter the chain from there. Amino acids can get converted to acetyl-CoA, which will then enter the chain, or amino acids can directly enter the tricarboxylic acid cycle. So amino acids don't start up here. They start a little bit lower down the chain. Fats, take a look at where fats come in. The glycerol can enter at the pyruvate stage. The fatty acids are going to enter at the acetyl-CoA stage. So all of the energy-yielding nutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats can be broken down to acetyl-CoA. Every one of them can be broken down to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA will then enter the cycle. Most of the reactions above release hydrogen atoms with their electrons, which are then carried by coenzymes to the electron transport chain. Those coenzymes are your NADH and your FADH2. ATP is synthesized, and then you've got some hydrogen ions react with water to produce, hydrogen ions react with the oxygen to produce water. So keep in mind, water is a byproduct of this reaction. Now let's talk about ketones for a second, because we've mentioned them a little bit. So this is just comparing glucose and ketones. So if you have glucose, which is your fuel source, it's going to come from carbohydrates, and this is going to burn that sugar to produce ATP. But let's say you don't have any glucose or don't have enough. Ketones are an alternative fuel source. They require fat because that's where they come from. This is fat burning mode. Y'all have probably heard some of this previously. So ketones are an alternative fuel source for the body that are made when glucose is in short supply. When are you going to have a low supply of glucose? What are you going to be doing in your day where you don't have any glucose in your blood? Well, you will have either not eaten for a very long time, or maybe you were asleep. You're not going to eat when you're asleep. Fasting, something along those lines. That's going to put your body into low glucose, which is then going to kick into ketone mode. Ketones, also known as ketone bodies, are formed when you don't have enough sugar, also known as glucose, to supply the body's fuel needs. This is going to occur, again, overnight when you're dieting or fasting. During these periods, your insulin levels are low. Remember when insulin is secreted? Insulin is secreted when glucose levels are high. Well, if you don't have any glucose in the blood, your glucose is low, well, your insulin levels are going to be low. But glucagon and epinephrine are going to be kind of normal. Ketosis, you need to know the definition, is a process that happens when your body doesn't have enough carbohydrates to burn for energy. Instead, it's going to burn fat and make things called these ketones, which can then be used for fuel. So again, it's that alternative fuel source. This just kind of shows a little bit about what's going on here. So again, based on what's going on with the pancreas, low insulin levels, high glucagon levels, that's going to trigger this adipose cell right here to offload some of those fatty acids. I'm not going to get into exactly the metabolism for that, but remember, adipose tissue is going to store triglycerides, which are made up of glycerol and fatty acids. So those fatty acids are going to exit, go to the liver, and turn into ketones. Those ketones are then going to enter the bloodstream and be used by the brain and tissues. Again, it's an alternative energy source. If you have no glucose, the brain has got to have something. Well, it'll use ketones instead. So ketone bodies are metabolic products, again, when sugar levels are low, that are produced in excess during excessive breakdown of fatty acids. There are 3 types of ketone bodies that are made. You've got acetoacetate, which is actually a ketone. Acetone, which is, again, another actual ketone. And then you've got beta hydroxybutyrate. Now, this is classified as one of the ketone bodies, but in reality, it's not an actual ketone. Ketones are based on structure. That's how they're labeled as ketones, is based on their chemical structure there. So they don't really, they're missing a component, but they're a byproduct of fatty acid metabolism. Ketone bodies are actually water soluble, so they will travel through the blood just fine, and they will produce energy. The combination of that low insulin but normal glucagon and epinephrine levels is what causes fat to be released from the fat cells. So you're in a fasting state, meaning you're not eating for whatever reason, whether you're asleep or dieting or whatever. The pancreas is going to be secreting the glucagon levels and decreased insulin. That is going to trigger ketogenesis to occur. So it's also going to cause those fat cells to release those fatty acids. They're going to go to the liver, and through the process of ketogenesis, they're going to turn into ketones. Those ketones are going to enter into the bloodstream and be used as an energy source by various things around the body, various structures around the body. The fats travel through the blood circulation to reach the liver, where they're processed into those ketone units. The ketone units then circulate back into the bloodstream, are picked up by muscle and other tissues like the brain and the heart to fuel your body's metabolism. Ketones are made in the liver from the breakdown of fats. So these are the fats. Fats break down into fatty acids. They go to the liver and get made into ketones. Ketogenesis, know the definition, is the production of ketone bodies by the breaking down of fatty acids. Ketone bodies can be utilized by most organs as fuel and can be a major alternative source of energy for the brain when glucose is not readily available. Ketosis. During times of starvation or carb-restrictive diets, the liver will break down those fatty acids into molecules that contain ketones. We just mentioned those. Ketones can be easily transported to other tissues and converted to acetyl-CoA, which can then enter the Krebs cycle and produce ATP, which is the point, right? We're trying to get ATP out of this. Ketone bodies can be utilized as fuel in the heart, the brain, and muscle, but not the liver, so the liver actually does need glucose, but it's okay. Remember, the liver stores glucose in the form of glycogen. One ketone group is going to produce about 22 ATP molecules, so not too bad, but you get more energy from glucose than you do from ketones. The liver uses amino acids as a fuel source as well. In the brain, ketones are used. So let's take a look at the brain and the heart. This is actual human brain right there. I just thought it was pretty cool. Glucose is virtually the sole fuel for the brain. That's normally what the brain has available, and that's what the brain is going to use. When glucose doesn't work anymore, when the brain can't get glucose, like for somebody who's a diabetic, ketones are going to be used. They are made in the liver from fat, and actually the brain really likes ketones. It almost likes it more than glucose, even though glucose is predominantly the main energy source because that's what it has. It really isn't upset about ketones. The brain doesn't have a fuel supply storage facility, so it cannot store glycogen. If it's going to get sugar, it has to get it from the blood because it doesn't have a storage facility. So when you run out of sugar in the blood, ketones will be used. But the brain requires continuous supply of glucose. The brain is very active. It accounts for about 20% of the body's metabolism when you're not doing anything. The brain is getting 20% of the metabolic needs of the body, even though it doesn't weigh as much as the rest of the body. So much of the energy is used to power transport mechanisms that maintain membrane potential. Remember, your nerves, your neurons have a membrane potential of about minus 70 millivolts. So what helps power that? You've got your sodium potassium pump, which is actively working. It requires ATP to maintain that minus 70 millivolts across that neuron so you can generate nerve impulses. So that's what a lot of that is used for. The brain must also synthesize neurotransmitters and receptors to propagate nerve impulses. So a lot of things are happening in the brain. Glucose is the essential metabolic fuel. If you have an acute or severe reduction of brain glucose levels, this can quickly lead to impairment of cognitive and reflex function, autonomic failure, seizures, loss of consciousness, permanent and irreversible brain damage. If not rapidly corrected, it could actually be lethal. So again, glucose is required by the brain to do its normal functions. Now, the heart actually prefers fatty acids for fuel. And I'll back up and say, the brain isn't upset about those ketones. As a matter of fact, infants, if you want to know why they have so much fat, infants are born kind of, with a lot of excess fat, because the brain, the developing brain, is using ketones rather than glucose. So babies and infants are going to use ketones to as their primary energy source for the brain. So pretty cool. And they're actually looking at a lot of data in this area as far as dementia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's, and things like that, and seeing if it's got something to do with the glucose versus ketones. If you give a patient ketones and put them in a state of ketosis and get them out of sugar, it actually helps the brain when they have issues such as Parkinson's and dementia and things like that. So that's an area of research that is ongoing. Now, is there anything to it? Well, the studies are not all out yet, but that's what they're looking at, and they're seeing positive things come from that. So the heart actually does prefer fatty acids for fuel. It's recognized as the key source of energy, as well as it will also use carbohydrate, sugar, such as glucose and lactate. The heart, just like the brain, does not have any glycogen reserves. You can't store glycogen in the heart muscle. So again, fatty acids are the main source of fuel. They actually don't know the relationship at the moment when I was typing this up. The relationship between ketones, fatty acids, and glucose and cardiac efficiency. So which one is better for cardiac efficiency? We know that the brain does really well with ketone bodies. What about the heart? So that's kind of not clear. Again, research being done in that area. So the next video is going to go over Objective 3. That concludes Objective 2.